The Montana winter of 1876 bit deep into the bones of any fool brave enough to venture into its frozen embrace. Jake Sullivan was such a fool, though he'd argue necessity had driven him to it rather than courage. His breath formed crystalline clouds in the bitter air as he guided his weary horse Dusty along the treacherous mountain trail that wound through the Bitterroot Valley. Jake was a man carved from the harsh realities of frontier life. At 35, his face bore the weathered lines of countless seasons spent under the unforgiving sun and bitter winds. His calloused hands, wrapped around the reins, told stories of cattle drives, fence mending, and the thousand small battles that defined a cowboy's existence. The worn leather of his chaps and the faded blue of his shirt spoke of a man who owned little, but had earned every thread through honest sweat. The reason for his desperate winter journey lay heavy in his saddlebags, not gold or silver, but something far more precious to a man like Jake: medical supplies. His younger brother Tom lay dying of pneumonia back in the settlement of Copper Creek, and the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride through this frozen hell. Jake had spent his last dollar on the medicine, keeping only a small pouch of dried beef and a single loaf of bread for the journey. As the pale sun struggled to pierce the heavy grey clouds, Jake's stomach cramped with hunger. He hadn't eaten since dawn, and that had been nothing more than a handful of cold beans. The bread in his pack called to him, but he resisted. He needed to save every crumb for the long journey ahead. The trail descended toward a small creek, its waters frozen solid beneath a blanket of snow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of Dusty's hooves and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was in this pristine wilderness that Jake first saw her. A small figure huddled beside the creek, nearly invisible against the white landscape. At first, Jake thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he drew closer, his heart clenched with recognition. It was a child, a young Native American girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, dressed in torn deerskin clothing that offered little protection against the brutal cold. Jake dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle before he caught himself. This was no threat. This was a child in desperate need. The girl looked up at him with dark eyes that held a mixture of fear and resignation. Her lips were blue with cold, and her small frame shook with violent shivers. "Easy there, little one," Jake said softly, his voice gentle despite the harsh rasp of cold air. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Her lips moved wordlessly, and Jake realized with growing horror that she was beyond speech, weakened by hunger and exposure to the point of collapse. Her clothing bore the distinctive beadwork of the Lakota people, and Jake's mind raced with the implications. The tensions between the settlers and the tribes had been escalating for months, but this child was no enemy. She was simply a human being in desperate need. Jake knelt beside her, noting the way her small hands clutched at her empty stomach. When had she last eaten? Days? Weeks? The sight of her suffering cut through Jake's own hunger like a knife through his heart. Without hesitation, he reached into his pack and withdrew the precious loaf of bread, his only food for the dangerous journey ahead. "Here, sweetheart," he murmured, breaking off a generous portion and placing it gently in her trembling hands. "You need this more than I do." The girl's eyes widened with disbelief and gratitude. She bit into the bread with desperate hunger, tears streaming down her cheeks as she ate. Jake watched her for a moment, then made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the man he'd been just minutes before. He broke off another piece, then another, until the entire loaf was gone and the child had eaten every crumb. "That's better," Jake said, though his own stomach protested loudly. "What's your name, little one?" The girl looked up at him with eyes that now held a spark of life. "Ayanna," she whispered in accented English. "My name, Ayanna." "Ayanna," Jake repeated, tasting the unfamiliar syllables. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Jake." The girl nodded, her strength slowly returning with the nourishment. Jake noticed that despite her obvious gratitude, there was something else in her eyes, a deep sadness that spoke of loss and separation. "Where's your family, Ayanna?" Jake asked gently. The girl's face crumpled, and she pointed toward the distant mountains. "Lost," she whispered. "Storm came. I got separated from hunting party. Been walking for days." Jake's heart ached for her. He understood now. She was alone in this vast wilderness, just as lost and vulnerable as any child could be. The realization that she might have died here, alone and forgotten, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the bitter cold. "Well, you're not alone anymore," Jake said firmly. "I can't take you with me, I've got urgent business to attend to, but I won't leave you here to freeze." Jake spent the next hour building a small shelter using fallen branches and his own bedroll. He showed Ayana how to keep a small fire burning and left her his extra blanket. Most importantly, he gave her half of his remaining dried beef, despite knowing it would leave him dangerously short of food for his own journey. "Listen to me carefully, Ayana," Jake said, kneeling beside her in the small shelter. "I've got to continue on my way. My brother's dying, and I'm the only one who can help him. But I want you to stay here, keep warm and wait. If your people are looking for you, they'll find you here by the creek." Ayana nodded solemnly, her small hand reaching out to touch Jake's weathered face. "Thank you," she whispered. "You save Ayana's life." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You just stay strong, little one. And remember, there are good people in this world, no matter what anybody tells you." As Jake prepared to leave, Ayana called out to him. "Jake," she said, her voice carrying a strange certainty, "the Great Spirit sees your kindness. You will be blessed for this." Jake touched the brim of his hat in farewell, not quite knowing what to make of her words. As he rode away, he glanced back once to see the small figure huddled by the fire, and he offered a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening that she would be found by her people. The trail ahead was treacherous, and Jake's empty stomach would make the journey even more difficult. But as he urged Dusty forward into the gathering dusk, he felt no regret about his decision. Some things, he reflected, were more important than a man's own comfort, and the life of a child was certainly one of them. The fire crackled softly in the makeshift shelter as Ayana waited, her small form wrapped in Jake's blanket. The cowboy's kindness had not only saved her life, but had kindled something deeper, a spark of hope that she carried like a sacred flame in her heart. As the hours passed, she whispered prayers to the Great Spirit, not for her own rescue, but for the kind man who had given her everything he had. 3 hours after Jake's departure, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Ayana's heart leaped as she recognized the distinctive war cries of her people. A search party of 12 Lakota warriors emerged from the tree line, led by her uncle, Chief Standing Bear, a man whose presence commanded respect across the entire territory. "Ayana!" Standing Bear's voice boomed across the frozen landscape as he dismounted and rushed to embrace his niece. The relief in his weathered face was unmistakable. This child was not just his brother's daughter, but the future of their people, destined to be a healer and spiritual guide. "Uncle," Ayana whispered, clinging to him with desperate relief, "I knew you would find me." Standing Bear's keen eyes quickly assessed the shelter, noting the careful construction and the provisions that had been left behind. "Child, how did you survive? Who built this shelter?" Ayana's eyes shone with reverence as she began to tell her story. "A cowboy, uncle. A white man with kind eyes and gentle hands. He found me dying by the creek, and he gave me his last food, his entire meal. He built this shelter with his own hands and left me his blanket even though he was traveling in the same cold." The warriors exchanged glances, their expressions skeptical. In their experience, white men took from the Lakota people. They did not give. But Standing Bear studied his niece's face and saw only truth in her dark eyes. "Tell me everything, child," he said softly. Ayana recounted every detail of her encounter with Jake, his gentleness, his sacrifice, the way he had knelt beside her and called her sweetheart with the tenderness of a father. She described how he had given away his only food without hesitation, how he had built her shelter and left her his warmth, even knowing he faced a dangerous journey ahead. "He said his brother was dying," Ayana continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He was carrying medicine, but he gave me his food instead of keeping it for himself. Uncle, this man, his heart is good. The Great Spirit sent him to save me." Standing Bear's expression grew thoughtful. In their culture, such an act of selfless generosity created a debt that could not be ignored. It was a sacred obligation that transcended the conflicts between their peoples. But more than that, it was a sign, a message from the spirits that not all white men were enemies. "What was this man's name?" Standing Bear asked. "Jake," Ayana replied. "He was riding east toward the settlements. He said he had urgent business. Standing Bear nodded slowly, his mind already working. He turned to his warriors, men who had fought alongside him in countless battles, men who trusted his judgment without question. "My brothers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we have heard something remarkable today. A white man has shown our child the greatest kindness. He has given his life sustenance to save her, asking nothing in return. This is not the action of an enemy, but of a friend," the warriors murmured among themselves, but their chief raised his hand for silence. "In our tradition, such kindness creates a bond that cannot be broken. This man Jake has shown that the Great Spirit's love flows through all people, regardless of the color of their skin. We are bound by honor to repay this debt." Young Crow Feather, one of the most skilled trackers in the tribe, stepped forward. "Chief, what would you have us do?" Standing Bear's eyes gleamed with purpose. "We will follow this man's trail. We will find him and show him that the Lakota people honor those who show mercy to their children. But first we must prepare properly for such a meeting." The party made camp by the creek, and Standing Bear sent swift riders back to the main village with specific instructions. Within hours, a larger group arrived, led by the chief's wife, Singing Bird, and several of the tribe's most skilled cooks and craftspeople. They came bearing gifts, blankets woven with intricate patterns, preserved meats, corn cakes, and healing herbs that were worth more than gold in the harsh winter landscape. But Standing Bear's plans went far beyond simple gifts. He understood that this moment represented something larger, an opportunity to bridge the growing chasm between his people and the white settlers. If one man could show such kindness, perhaps others could as well. "We will not approach him as strangers," Standing Bear announced to his gathered people. "We will come as family, as friends. This man Jake has shown us that the Great Spirit's love knows no boundaries. We will show him the same." Meanwhile, Jake pushed through the bitter night, his empty stomach cramping with hunger. The wind had picked up, driving snow directly into his face, and Dusty struggled to maintain footing on the increasingly treacherous trail. Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to the little girl he'd left by the creek, and he found himself whispering prayers for her safety. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, Jake finally reached the settlement of Pine Ridge, a small trading post that served as a way station for travelers. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Samuel Carson, greeted him with the wariness that had become common in recent months. "Jake Sullivan," Carson said, eyeing the cowboy's haggard appearance, "you look like hell. What brings you through in this weather?" "Medicine for my brother," Jake replied simply, dismounting with difficulty. His legs were stiff from the cold, and his empty stomach made him lightheaded. "Got any food to spare? I can work for it." Carson's expression softened slightly. "Your brother still sick?" "Hell, Jake, you should have said something." "Mary," he called to his wife, "fix this man some breakfast. He's riding mercy." As Jake gratefully accepted the hot meal, he found himself telling Carson about his encounter with the Lakota girl. The trading post owner listened with growing amazement. "So you gave her your last food?" Carson asked incredulously. "Jake, that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever heard. These are dangerous times to be showing kindness to Indians." Jake's jaw tightened. "She was a child, Sam. A hungry, frightened child. I don't care what color her skin was." Carson studied Jake's face and saw the absolute conviction there. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose if more men thought like you, we might not have all these problems." What neither man knew was that at that very moment, Standing Bear and his warriors were following Jake's trail with the skill of born hunters. The snow had covered most of the tracks, but the Lakota had other ways of following a man's path. Broken twigs, disturbed stones, the subtle signs that only those raised in the wilderness could read. By midday, they had reached the trading post, and Standing Bear called a halt just beyond the tree line. Through careful observation, they confirmed that Jake was indeed inside the building, his distinctive horse tied outside. "Now we wait," Standing Bear said quietly. "When he leaves, we will follow at a distance. I want to understand this man better before we approach him." The chief's plan was more complex than a simple gesture of gratitude. He intended to study Jake, to learn what kind of man would sacrifice his own well-being for a stranger's child. Only when he was certain of the cowboy's character would he make his move. As Jake prepared to leave Pine Ridge, well-fed and grateful for Carson's hospitality, He had no idea that his simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would change not only his own life, but the relationship between two peoples who had been driven apart by fear and misunderstanding. The trail ahead wound through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country in the territory, and Jake rode with renewed purpose. His brother was waiting, and he would not fail him. But behind him, hidden in the vast wilderness, the Lakota followed, bearing gifts and carrying a message of hope that would soon transform both their worlds. Jake's journey continued eastward through the rugged Montana territory, the medicine for his brother Tom secured carefully in his saddlebags. The meal at Pine Ridge had restored his strength, but the harsh conditions made every mile a battle against the elements. Ice crystals formed on his mustache, and Dusty's breath created clouds of vapor that froze almost instantly in the bitter air. The trail wound through a narrow canyon where towering pine trees created a natural windbreak. Jake was grateful for the relative shelter, though he remained alert for signs of danger. These mountains were known to harbor both wild animals and desperate men, driven to extremes by the harsh winter. As he rounded a bend in the trail, Jake's heart nearly stopped. Ahead of him, spread across a small clearing, was a sight that would have sent most men reaching for their weapons. Nearly 30 Lakota warriors, mounted and waiting in perfect formation. Their presence was both magnificent and terrifying, proud men wrapped in buffalo robes and blankets, their faces painted with the traditional markings of their people. But something was wrong with this picture. Instead of the aggressive postures Jake might have expected, the warriors sat quietly, their weapons clearly visible but not drawn. At their head was a man whose bearing spoke of absolute authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray in his long black hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but he stopped himself. These men could have attacked him already if that had been their intention. Instead, they waited with the patience of predators who had already chosen their moment. The leader urged his horse forward, stopping just 20 feet from Jake. When he spoke, his English was precise and formal, carrying the weight of generations of leadership. "You are Jake Sullivan," Standing Bear said. It was not a question. Jake straightened in his saddle, meeting the chief's gaze directly. "I am. And you are?" "I am Standing Bear, chief of the Lakota people of this region. We have been following you since dawn." Jake's mouth went dry. "If you're here to settle some old score, Chief, I should tell you that I've never raised a hand against your people. I'm just a cowboy trying to save his brother's life." Standing Bear's expression remained neutral, but Jake caught something that might have been approval in his dark eyes. "We know of your mission, Jake Sullivan. We also know what you did for a lost child by the frozen creek." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought of Ayana, the little girl he'd left by the fire. Did you find her? Is she safe?" "She is safe," Standing Bear replied, and now there was no mistaking the warmth in his voice. "She is my brother's daughter, and she is precious to our people. She told us of your kindness." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank God, I've been worried about her since I left." Standing Bear studied Jake carefully, noting the genuine concern in the cowboy's voice. Here was a man who had risked his own life to save a child, and who still worried about her welfare, even when facing a war party of armed warriors. "You gave her your last food," Standing Bear said. "She was starving," Jake replied simply. "What else was I supposed to do?" "Most men would have ridden past," Standing Bear said. "Most white men would have seen an Indian child and felt no obligation to help." Jake's jaw tightened. "Then most men are fools." "A child is a child regardless of the color of her skin." The words hung in the cold air between them, and Jake saw something shift in the faces of the warriors surrounding him. These men had fought against white settlers, had seen their people killed and their lands stolen. But here was a white man who spoke of their children with the same protection he would offer his own. Standing Bear raised his hand, and the warriors began to dismount. Jake tensed, unsure of what was happening, but the chief's next words stopped him cold. "Jake Sullivan, you have shown great kindness to our people. In our tradition, such kindness creates a bond that cannot be broken. We have come to repay our debt to you." Jake watched in amazement as the warriors began unpacking items from their horses, blankets, beautifully woven and warm, packages of preserved meat and corn cakes, leather pouches filled with healing herbs, a pair of moccasins that looked both practical and comfortable. "Chief, I appreciate the gesture," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion, "but I don't need payment for helping a child. That's just what any decent person would do. Standing Bear smiled for the first time, and the expression transformed his entire face. That is exactly why you deserve our gifts, Jake Sullivan. You see no debt because you see no difference between our children and yours. The chief dismounted and approached Jake, carrying a magnificent buffalo robe that gleamed with intricate beadwork. This belonged to my father, and his father before him. It is a gift worthy of a man who has shown our people that not all white men are enemies. Jake dismounted as well, overwhelmed by the generosity being shown to him. Chief, this is too much. That robe, it's beautiful. It must be worth a fortune. It is worth exactly what you paid for it, Standing Bear replied. You gave everything you had to save a child's life. We give you everything we can to honor that sacrifice. As the warriors continued to unpack their gifts, Jake found himself surrounded by more food and supplies than he had seen in months. The preserved meat alone would last him weeks, and the healing herbs would be invaluable for his brother's recovery. But beyond the material gifts, something else was happening. The warriors, initially reserved and formal, began to relax as they saw Jake's genuine appreciation for their offerings. One of them, a young man named Crow Feather, approached with a beautifully carved wooden canteen. "This will not freeze," he said in carefully pronounced English. "Good for winter travel." "Thank you," Jake replied, accepting the gift with reverence. This is incredible workmanship." Crow Feather beamed with pride. "I make it myself. Take many days." Standing Bear watched these interactions with growing satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a moment of genuine connection between peoples who had been taught to fear each other. Jake Sullivan was proving to be exactly the kind of man his actions had suggested, honorable, grateful, and completely without prejudice. "There is one more gift," Standing Bear said, and his voice carried a note of particular significance. "My daughter, Singing Bird, has prepared a feast for you. She wishes to thank the man who saved her niece." Jake's eyes widened. "A feast? Chief, I'm honored, but I need to get this medicine to my brother. He's dying." Standing Bear nodded gravely. "We know of your brother's illness. The herbs we have given you will help him recover, but only if you are strong enough to complete your journey. You have been traveling for days without proper food or rest. One more day will not make the difference between life and death for your brother, but it might for you." Jake realized the wisdom in the chief's words. He had been pushing himself to the point of exhaustion, and the mountain trail ahead was treacherous. If he collapsed from hunger or exposure, his brother would die regardless of the medicine. "Besides," Standing Bear added with a slight smile, "my daughter has been cooking since dawn. It would be an insult to refuse her hospitality." Jake found himself smiling despite the gravity of the situation. "Well, I certainly wouldn't want to insult a lady's cooking." As if summoned by their conversation, a group of women appeared from the trees, led by a dignified woman in her 40s, whose bearing spoke of both strength and grace. This was Singing Bird, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing a large household. "Jake Sullivan," she said, her English accented but clear, "you are welcome in our camp. We have prepared food to honor your kindness to our child." Jake removed his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm deeply honored by your hospitality." What followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The Lakota had prepared a feast that would have been impressive even in the best of circumstances, but in the middle of a harsh winter, in the wilderness, it was nothing short of miraculous. Roasted venison, corn cakes, wild rice, and vegetables that had been carefully preserved through the long months. But more than the food, it was the atmosphere that moved Jake. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing through the trees. The warriors who had seemed so intimidating earlier now shared stories and jokes. Women worked efficiently but cheerfully, adding constant touches to the meal. And at the center of it all was Ayana, completely recovered from her ordeal, helping to serve the feast and staying close to Jake as if he were a beloved uncle. "Jake," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "try this. My grandmother made it specially for you." Jake accepted the offering, a sweet cake made from berries and honey, and found himself fighting back tears. These people had taken a stranger into their midst and were treating him like family, all because of one simple act of kindness. As the feast continued, Jake found himself thinking about the stories he'd heard about Indian raids and savage attacks. Looking around at these people, these families with their children and grandparents, their laughter and their generosity, He realized how wrong those stories had been. The sun was setting by the time the feast concluded, and Jake knew that his life had been changed forever. He had come into these mountains as a simple cowboy on a mission of mercy. He was leaving as a man who had glimpsed the possibility of peace between two peoples who had been taught to hate each other. As dawn broke over the Lakota camp, Jake Sullivan found himself experiencing something he had never expected. He was reluctant to leave. The warmth of the people, the genuine bonds he had formed overnight, and the profound sense of belonging he felt among these supposed enemies had touched something deep in his soul. Standing Bear approached as Jake was packing his supplies, now significantly heavier thanks to the tribe's generosity. The chief's expression was solemn, but his eyes held a warmth that had not been there when they first met. "Jake Sullivan," Standing Bear said, "you came to us as a stranger, but you leave as a brother. This is not a word we use lightly." Jake stopped his packing and looked directly at the chief. "The honor is mine, Chief. I've learned more about life in one day with your people than I had in all my years before." Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "That is the mark of a wise man, one who can learn from any teacher. But there is something more I must tell you before you go." The chief gestured for Jake to sit beside him on a fallen log. Around them, the camp was stirring to life, but the other tribe members gave them space for this private conversation. "Yesterday, when we found you, I was testing you," Standing Bear said quietly. "I wanted to see what kind of man would sacrifice his own survival for a child he had never met. I wanted to understand your heart." Jake nodded, having suspected as much. "And what did you find?" "I found a man who sees with the eyes of the Great Spirit," Standing Bear replied. "A man who understands that kindness is not weakness, but the greatest strength a person can possess." Standing Bear reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small, intricately carved stone pendant. "This is a sacred object among our people. It represents the circle of life, how good deeds return to bless the giver. I want you to have it." Jake accepted the pendant with reverence, feeling its smooth weight in his palm. "Chief, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Standing Bear smiled. "But remember this, you are always welcome among the Lakota people. Your kindness has created a bond between us that will outlast both our lifetimes." As Jake prepared to mount Dusty, little Ayanna ran up to him, carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "Jake," she said, her dark eyes shining with affection, "this is for your brother. It's medicine from our healers, but also something else." Jake knelt down to her level and carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a collection of healing herbs, but also a small wooden carving of a horse. Simple but beautiful, crafted with obvious love. "I made it myself," Ayanna said proudly. "So your brother will know that the Lakota people are praying for him to get well." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Ayanna, this is the most beautiful gift I've ever received. I promise you, my brother will treasure this always." The little girl threw her arms around Jake's neck, hugging him tightly. "Come back and visit us," she whispered. "Promise me you'll come back." "I promise," Jake replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The journey to Copper Creek took Jake another day and a half, but he traveled with a lighter heart than he had felt in years. The food provided by the Lakota sustained him, the buffalo robe kept him warm, and the memory of their kindness gave him strength to push through the final miles. When he finally reached the small settlement where his brother lay dying, Jake found Tom in even worse condition than he had feared. The young man was burning with fever, his breathing labored and painful. Doc Morrison, the town's aging physician, met Jake at the door with a grim expression. "Jake, I'm glad you made it back," Doc Morrison said quietly. "But I have to tell you, I don't think Tom has much time left." Jake's jaw tightened with determination. "He's not dying on my watch, Doc. I've brought medicine, and I've brought something else, hope." Jake administered the medicine he had purchased, but he also used the healing herbs provided by the Lakota, following the careful instructions that Singing Bird had given him. The combination of modern medicine and traditional healing proved remarkably effective, and by the end of the first day, Tom's fever had broken. "Jake," Tom whispered weakly, "what happened to you out there? You look different." Jake smiled, fingering the sacred pendant around his neck. "I met some people who taught me what it really means to be human, Tom. I learned that kindness is the most powerful force in the world." Over the following days, as Tom gradually recovered, Jake told his brother about his encounter with the Lakota people. Tom listened with growing amazement, particularly when Jake showed him Ayana's carved horse. "She made this for me," Tom asked, his voice filled with wonder. "The little Indian girl made this for a man she's never met." "That's what kindness does, Tom," Jake replied. "It creates connections that go beyond race, beyond fear, beyond all the things that divide us." Tom studied the carving with new eyes. "Jake, this changes everything. If their people can show such generosity to strangers, then maybe we've been wrong about a lot of things," Jake finished. "Maybe there's hope for peace after all." Word of Jake's encounter with the Lakota spread quickly through Copper Creek, and the reaction was mixed. Some people praised his courage and compassion, while others questioned his judgment in trusting hostile Indians. But Jake found that he no longer cared about the opinions of those who chose fear over understanding. 3 weeks after Tom's recovery, Jake was surprised to see a familiar figure approaching the settlement. It was Crow Feather, the young Lakota warrior who had gifted him the wooden canteen. The young man rode alone, carrying a white flag of truce. "Jake Sullivan," Crow Feather called out as he approached. "I bring message from Chief Standing Bear." Jake hurried out to meet him, noting the suspicious stares of the townspeople. "Crow Feather, it's good to see you. What news do you bring?" The young warrior smiled. "Chief says to tell you that the child Ayana speaks of you every day. She asks when her white brother will come to visit." Jake felt his heart warm at the words. "Tell her I haven't forgotten my promise, and tell the chief that his gifts helped save my brother's life." Crow Feather nodded approvingly. "This is good, but there is more. Chief Standing Bear wishes to meet with the leaders of your settlement. He believes that if one man can show such kindness, perhaps others can as well." Jake's pulse quickened. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a chance to bridge the gap between the two communities. "I'll speak to our mayor immediately. When would the chief like to meet?" "When the moon is full," Crow Feather replied. "At the same creek where you found Ayana, the place where kindness was first shown." Over the following days, Jake worked tirelessly to arrange the meeting. Some townspeople were skeptical, but others were intrigued by the possibility of peace. Mayor Henderson, a practical man who understood the cost of conflict, agreed to attend. The meeting took place exactly as Crow Feather had described, at the creek where Jake had first encountered Ayana. Standing Bear arrived with a small delegation of his most trusted advisors, while the settlement was represented by Mayor Henderson, Doc Morrison, and several other prominent citizens. Jake served as translator and mediator, his unique relationship with both sides, making him the perfect bridge between the two communities. The negotiations were delicate, but both sides approached them with genuine goodwill. Standing Bear spoke with eloquent dignity about his people's desire for peace and mutual respect. "We do not seek to drive you from our lands," he said, "but we ask that you remember we were here first. Perhaps there is a way for both our peoples to share this beautiful country." Mayor Henderson, initially nervous about the meeting, found himself genuinely moved by the chief's words. "Chief, I think most of us want the same thing, to live in peace and provide for our families. Maybe it's time we stopped seeing each other as enemies." The agreement they reached was simple but profound. Both communities would respect each other's territories and customs. Trade would be encouraged, with the Lakota providing furs and crafts in exchange for manufactured goods and medical supplies. Most importantly, both sides committed to peaceful resolution of any conflicts that might arise. As the meeting concluded, Ayana appeared at her uncle's side, having been allowed to attend as a symbol of the innocence that had brought them all together. She ran directly to Jake, hugging him tightly. "You came back," she said joyfully, "just like you promised." Jake lifted her up, smiling broadly. "I always keep my promises, little one, always." Standing Bear watched this reunion with deep satisfaction. "Jake Sullivan," he said, "you have given our peoples a great gift. You have shown us that kindness is stronger than fear. That understanding is possible even between the most unlikely friends." Years later, when Jake had become a respected rancher and peace advocate, he would often tell the story of his encounter with Ayana. The creek where they met became known as Kindness Creek, and the agreement forged there lasted for decades. Tom Sullivan, fully recovered and deeply changed by his brother's experience, became a teacher who specialized in promoting understanding between different cultures. He kept Ayana's carved horse on his desk as a reminder of the power of simple gestures to change the world. The settlement of Copper Creek grew and prospered, becoming known throughout the territory as a place where different peoples could live and work together in harmony. The Lakota established a trading post there, and it became common to see Native American and white children playing together in the streets. Jake married a schoolteacher named Sarah, who shared his vision of a world where kindness transcended racial boundaries. Their children grew up speaking both English and Lakota, and they considered Ayanna to be their beloved aunt. Sarah often said that she fell in love with Jake, not because of his rugged good looks, but because of the gentleness she saw in his eyes when he spoke about the little girl who had changed his life. Standing Bear kept his word about the peace agreement, and under his leadership, the relationship between the two communities flourished. He lived to see his great-grandchildren attending school alongside white children, learning to read and write, while still maintaining their tribal traditions. Ayanna grew into a beautiful and wise young woman who became a bridge between worlds. She learned English perfectly, but never forgot her native tongue. She studied both traditional healing and modern medicine, becoming a respected healer who treated patients regardless of their heritage. Many said she inherited her gift for bringing people together from the spirits, but those who knew her best understood that she had learned it from a cowboy who had shown her that kindness was the universal language of the human heart. The wooden horse she had carved for Tom Sullivan became a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations as a symbol of the day when two worlds came together through the simple act of sharing bread with a hungry child. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines around Kindness Creek, old-timers would tell the story of the cowboy who gave his last piece of bread to a starving girl, and how that single act of compassion had created a legacy of peace that would endure for generations. Jake Sullivan lived to be an old man, respected by all who knew him. In his final years, he would often sit by the creek where he had first met Ayanna, reflecting on the simple truth that had guided his life. That kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change the world. When he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, representatives from dozens of tribes attended his funeral, standing side by side with the white settlers he had called friends. Chief Standing Bear's grandson spoke at the service, saying words that captured the essence of Jake's legacy. This man showed us that the Great Spirit lives in all people, regardless of the color of their skin. He proved that a single act of kindness can create ripples that spread across generations, bringing light to places that had known only darkness. He was our brother, our friend, and our teacher. The world is better because Jake Sullivan chose to see a hungry child not as a stranger, but as a precious life worth saving. As the mourners dispersed, Ayanna, now a grandmother herself, placed a single piece of bread on Jake's grave, the same gesture that had started it all so many years before. She whispered a prayer in Lakota, asking the spirits to carry her adopted brother safely to the next world, where kindness would continue to flourish under his gentle guidance. The story of Jake Sullivan and the little girl by the creek became legend, passed down through countless generations as a reminder that in a world often divided by fear and prejudice, the simple act of sharing what we have with those who need it most can create miracles that last forever. And in the end, that was Jake's greatest gift to the world. Not the peace treaty he helped forge, not the settlement he helped build, but the understanding that every human being, regardless of their background, carries within them the capacity for extraordinary kindness. All it takes is the courage to act on it, even when, especially when, it requires sacrifice. The creek still flows today, and travelers who stop to rest beside its banks sometimes report hearing the laughter of children playing, the soft murmur of different languages blending together in harmony, and the gentle whisper of the wind carrying a message as old as humanity itself. That kindness is the thread that weaves us all together, creating a tapestry of hope that can never be torn apart by those who choose fear over love. In the end, Jake Sullivan's legacy was not measured in acres owned or cattle counted, but in the countless acts of kindness that rippled outward from that single moment when a cowboy chose to see a hungry child and decided that her life was worth more than his own comfort. It was a legacy that would endure as long as there were people willing to choose compassion over indifference, understanding over hatred, and love over fear. The story concludes as it began, with a simple truth that transcends time and culture, that in our darkest moments when hope seems lost and divisions seem insurmountable, the light of human kindness can still shine through, reminding us that we are all connected by the simple fact of our shared humanity. Jake Sullivan understood this truth, lived it, and passed it on to future generations, ensuring that the circle of kindness would continue to grow, one generous heart at a time.